Hello. Are we set? Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's event on the implementation of Israel's new humanitarian rules and the role of NGOs and the formidable challenges facing international humanitarian action around the world in this new year. Over the last 2.5 years, 565 aid workers, over 1,500 health workers, and over 380 employees of the UN Relief Work Agency and others have lost their lives in Gaza, the highest death toll of humanitarian workers on record. Despite the politically charged environment and the danger to NGO workers, UN and international aid organizations have continued to operate and to do their best to meet the most acute needs of the population. On December 30th, the Israeli government announced its decision to decertify 37 prominent international humanitarian organizations under the new Israeli re-registration requirements, which passed the Knesset in March 2025. While these groups have 60 days to appeal, the announcement reinforces the ongoing tensions between UN and international NGOs and the Netanyahu government, which have been a central feature of the Gaza conflict from the start. Among other requirements, under Israel's new regulations, humanitarian groups are required to provide detailed personal information on local staff and their families. NGOs risk losing their right to operate if they fail to abstain from public criticism of Israel and express support for legal actions against Israel in foreign or international courts. The Israeli government has maintained that the new rules are necessary to prevent Hamas infiltration and systematic aid diversion, a claim that has been repeatedly leveled and repeatedly disputed by aid groups and senior former U.S. officials, including U.S. humanitarian czar David Satterfield and former U.S. ambassador to Israel, Jack Lew. Today, we will try to understand the new law's potential impact on delivery of humanitarian assistance and other critical humanitarian operations in Gaza and the West Bank. We will also look at how the Gaza experience reflects the broader changes in the international humanitarian system, the push for privatization, and what it means for the future of humanitarian action. We are very fortunate to have three incredible humanitarian leaders with us today. Janti Soeripto, the president and CEO of Save the Children, Athena Rayburn, the executive director of AIDA, the Association of International Development Agencies operating within the Palestinian territories, and Jeremy Konyndyk, the president of Refugees International. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today for this discussion. Before we begin the conversation, I'd like to read the bios. Janti Soeripto has been president and CEO of Save the Children since January 2020, following her tenure as president and COO. She leads the organization's strategy, humanitarian response, and overall operations. Previously, she spent 8 years as deputy CEO of Save the Children International, driving market growth and global strategy. She began her career in the private sector with roles at Kimberly-Clark and Unilever. She holds a master's degree in economics and finance and speaks 4 languages. She's based in Connecticut. Athena Rayburn is the executive director of the Association of International Development Agencies, AIDA. AIDA represents 100 INGOs operating within the occupied Palestinian territories. In this capacity, Athena has led negotiations and discussions with Israeli authorities, UN, member states on issues impacting INGO delivery in Gaza, the West Bank, including issues of INGO registration. Prior to joining AIDA, Athena was an advocate and communications professional for NGOs in Eastern Europe and South Asia. Last but not least, Jeremy Konyndyk is president of Refugees International. He has served in senior positions at AID, 2 U.S. administrations, and a range of NGO leadership positions. As director of AID's Office of International Foreign Disaster Relief, Jeremy led the U.S. government's response to the displacement crisis in conflict areas such as Syria, South Sudan, and northern Iraq. From 2017 to 2020, he led the Rethinking Humanitarian Reform Policy Initiative of the Center for Global Development, and he has worked extensively as a leader in the humanitarian NGO sector in Africa and the Balkans as well. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Before we start, I just wanted to make a brief comment about the stressful moment that we're all in. The situation in Gaza continues to get worse. NGOs are facing all kinds of new restrictions and on their activities, including the implications of the newly implemented Israeli NGO law. So that's the backdrop of everything that we will discuss today. But humanitarians have been hard at work, trying to save lives, trying to help people live day to day in extremely horrific conditions. And these are some of the leaders that we can thank for the work that they're doing in this area. So Janti, I will open the discussion with you and ask you to talk about SAVE and SAVE's work on the ground and how you see the situation moving forward. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Katherine. And thank you for continuing to highlight the situation there. And it is, as always, for the last 2.5 years, very fluid. SAVE has been there since 1953. And we're on the ground. We have over 200 staff, colleagues in Gaza currently, and another almost 100 on the West Bank. And many of our colleagues there have worked for us for many decades. We're doing what SAVE does in situations like this. We focus on children and families in need. There are currently 1.6 million people in Gaza, among which 800,000 kids, so about half of the population, who are still in acute food insecurity. Over 100,000 young infants under 5-year-olds are expected to suffer acute malnutrition symptoms over the coming months still. Notwithstanding the peace agreement, which has led to a lessening of the violence, a somewhat safer surrounding, and some more food coming in to Gaza, there's still not nearly enough to address all the needs, certainly not to address malnutrition symptoms for babies and mothers in particular. It is winter there now. We hear stories from our colleagues who are talking to mothers who are trying to keep their babies warm in sub-zero temperatures, amongst floods. They're sleeping in completely inadequate tents. Over the last 2 days, I think 7,000 tents were swept away because of storms and floods. Children are walking through sewage water. There is no solid waste removal system or structure at all, and hasn't been over the last 2 years. So you can imagine what that looks like on the ground after that time. So it is, babies are dying from hypothermia over these past couple of weeks. Can you just for once, just imagine that you're trying to keep your babies alive in tents, in these temperatures, in these conditions, knowing that relief could be provided really easily, quickly, cost effectively, and it's not happening. So, the situation is still utterly dire, and nowhere nearly are we getting access, the amount of access and supplies and staff support in that we would need if we could do to help us do the things that we would like to do. We're doing still a lot. We're running 2 primary healthcare clinics in Gaza. We're running, I think, 30 learning spaces. We're running 25 child-friendly spaces where children can play and learn and sing songs and try to be children for once. There is also trauma-informed counselors present to help children with their mental health and psychosocial support. We're delivering clean water to 91 sites, to thousands and thousands of people. We're treating children and mothers for malnutrition symptoms, thousands of them. We're helping them deliver their babies as safely as possible. So we're doing a lot. We would like to do 2, 3, 5, 10 times more. And that currently is being made incredibly difficult for us and also clearly for some of our colleagues.
Okay. Can you just mention following the ceasefire, how did that directly impact your ability to work. And what work are you doing now with orphans?
So the ceasefire, in a way, didn't impact us. I mean, it made Gaza a little less violent, less shelling, less bombing. More food has come in, more commercial supplies are coming in. But again, people don't have any money now to buy things. So winter clothes are not available to most people. So young children in the winter, and we've warned against this, that winter was coming and that we needed to get adequate supplies in to help people withstand these temperatures and adverse weather, particularly because almost everybody is now in a tent. I think 80% of the Gaza population lives in tents, and these are not very fancy tents, by the way, because it's also difficult to get proper supplies in that allows better infrastructure or even camp-like conditions, right? These are really rickety, a couple of wooden stakes. I've been there last year, wooden stakes and a piece of tarp that people have found on the ground, and that is then your tent. That is no place for anybody, and certainly not for young children. So yes, the peace agreement has gave us hope that there was then a phase 2 where there would be adequate humanitarian supplies coming in, where adequate humanitarian workers could rotate in and out to help scale up our humanitarian assistance. But those things haven't happened yet.
Okay, thank you. Athena, I'll turn to you now. Can you explain the role of AIDA, the organization that you head? And can you talk to us about the work of the NGO community, both in Gaza and the West Bank, and to the extent it's relevant, in East Jerusalem as well?
Hi, Catherine. Thanks so much. So as AIDA, we work with just over 100 NGOs, which make up all of the sort of largest organizations that people are familiar with, and work to try and ensure access for our member services. In that role, we spend a lot of time speaking with member states and also the Israeli authorities and the Palestinian Authority to make sure that we can continue to deliver services. In terms of the footprint for NGOs inside Gaza and the West Bank, our organizations provide healthcare, nutrition support, education services, protection, shelter, food, support to displaced families, pretty much every public service and life-saving assistance that you can imagine. What's important about our work as NGOs is, importantly, all of it is also focused on building an exit strategy so that we are reducing dependence on assistance and handing over skills and capacity to local communities so they can move towards self-sufficiency. In particular, though, in the last 2 years in Gaza, this work of an exit strategy has been completely upended. The bombardment of the last 2 years, as we know, has pretty much decimated all the schools, hospitals, clinics, roads, and civilian infrastructure. And as Janti said, leaving the vast majority of the population living in tents in what's become an incredibly harsh winter. Reliance on our services in Gaza and also the West Bank has never been higher, especially following the restrictions that we've seen placed on organizations such as UNRWA. NGOs with our Palestinian NGO partners are now the primary providers of life-saving assistance inside Gaza and the West Bank. I find that many people are often surprised to learn that, for example, the UN inside Gaza only has 360 staff around. So when we're looking at delivering assistance at minimum to 1.3 million people inside Gaza, the bulk of that service delivery is done by us as NGOs. And because of the decades of experience that we've had, we are able to do this work with no need for additional security for our staff, no use of guns or weapons in any of our programming, relying on our community engagement and acceptance that ensures our operations have been able to continue without excessive interference. In terms of our footprint, in 2025, our member organizations were responsible for over 750 million USD in humanitarian assistance across Gaza and the West Bank. This includes money granted from UN agencies and accounts for just over half of all the assistance delivered in both Gaza and the West Bank as well. For example, last year, NGOs were responsible for delivering over half of the UN World Food Programme's assistance in Gaza, which amounts to around 220 million worth of food assistance. And to give you an idea in terms of some of the programming, there are around 195 cooked meal provision points across Gaza. and 132 of them, which is just under 70%, rely directly on our member organizations. This level of work is also reflected across health. For example, in the last year, NGOs were directly responsible for 123,000 emergency admissions, 50,000 treatments for patients of victims of shelling and other forms of violence, just under 10,000 surgical interventions, and 8,700 births. If you look at the footprint across Gaza, 1 in 3 health facilities would close without NGO support. In particular, we run the largest amount of programming for children that are suffering from severe and acute malnutrition, with NGOs accounting for, actually at the moment, 100% of all inpatient capacity inside Gaza to treat children with severe and acute malnutrition. Something that is also, I think, often not discussed, but at the moment, there's a lot of interest in the issue of reconstruction. There is no reconstruction without mine clearance and the clearing of unexploded ordnance. NGOs lead globally in this, and this is again reflected in Gaza and the West Bank, where if NGOs are not able to continue delivering, capacity inside Gaza and the West Bank for mine clearance would fall by around 70%. So it goes without saying there's no reconstruction without mine clearance happening first. The situation we're in now with regards to the registration policy and what's happening is that all of these services that I've just described are at risk because of this new registration policy that introduced requirements that these NGOs can't comply with. It's really important to note in the context of Gaza and the West Bank that we are running out of actors who can replace us. With the restrictions placed on UNRWA, with the state of services inside Gaza and areas of the West Bank with very high displacement, NGOs are oftentimes in some areas the only actors left. And it's not simply possible to just replace decades of experience and expertise with unexperienced or new actors or private sector actors. We saw, of course, last year just how catastrophic the consequences can be when you see actors without the experience or expertise in humanitarian assistance, especially in a context such as Gaza, piloting new methods of aid delivery. For example, with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation concept last year, which led to thousands of casualties and deaths in Gaza as people sought aid at militarized distribution sites. With so much at stake now, including the peace plan, fragile ceasefire, and future security and safety for both Palestinian and Israeli civilians, the risks of removing the largest actors delivering essential services are massive, both to Israel and Palestine. It puts not just lives at immediate risk, but at a time where we're trying to scale up assistance, but also the peace plan, an effort in which the US exerted a significant amount of pressure and immense capital that is all being risked now by this new policy. To give a very brief bit of background, the previous system of registration, so our members, we are registered under the Palestinian Authority, and previously we were registered with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs inside Israel. I would describe that process as pretty innocuous. It's pretty similar to how you would register as a 501c3 in the US. The new process that's been introduced involves 10 ministries that are led by the Ministry of Diaspora and Combating Anti-Semitism. Most of the ministries involved have not really had any prior engagement directly in Gaza or the West Bank or history really of working with humanitarian actors. There are 2 big primary issues with the registration process. So first is the criteria that can be used to either reject or accept an organization's application, which really allows for those organizations, for example, some of the criteria to be removed on the basis of their advocacy that they might have done that could highlight violations of international humanitarian law or harm to civilian populations inside Gaza and the West Bank, with this advocacy being termed as an action that delegitimizes the state of Israel. This is a move that has been criticized by many Israeli human rights and pro-democracy organizations that have called out this criteria as inconsistent with Israel's values as a Jewish and democratic state. For many organizations, one of the other issues is the issue of providing a list of our Palestinian staff to the Israeli intelligence services for the purposes of vetting. In that instance, they would then call our organizations, request us to fire staff based on their reports. As we have explained, and in my role, we have had many dialogues with the relevant Israeli ministries to say, we can't comply with this requirement for many reasons, and have really tried to look for alternatives that would allow them to ensure and address their security concerns and for us to retain our independence as humanitarian actors. It's really important globally for humanitarians to maintain our independence, and this is essential to make sure that aid gets into the right hands. All over the world, in other contexts that I've worked in, for example, in Afghanistan, we are frequently requested by armed groups and states for them to be able to be involved in our hiring processes. The reason for this is it is the easiest way to interfere with how our assistance is delivered, and that's why we can't comply. Agreeing to do so in Israel would set a precedent that creates a risk to our operations worldwide. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to find a solution with the government of Israel. We have tried to request a number of meetings, but have either not had them responded to, and as a result, haven't found a mutually acceptable solution. And recently, there has been, I think, a really regrettable escalation in some of the rhetoric and discussions. Instead of trying to understand the position that we're in as organizations with wanting to try and register and comply, our decision that we're unable to has been painted that our organizations have something to hide. In addition, we've seen a lot of statements recently coming from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Diaspora Ministry that have minimized the role we play inside Gaza, with some claims, for example, that the NGOs impacted only represent 1% of the aid in Gaza, which, as I've illustrated, is not quite the case. So now, to sort of summarize and conclude where we're at, we are in a state of battling narratives when, frankly, the focus of all of us right now should be, what do we need to do to ensure the protection of Palestinian and Israeli lives, ensure the continuity of the peace plan, and make sure we have a successful move to phase 2 that does protect everyone. And at this point, with the level of desperation inside Gaza, all any of our staff want to do is to be able to get back to our jobs and save lives. And all of that is at risk at the moment. And that really, from now and into the future, will continue to be our message, that we just want to be able to do our jobs.
Well, that's a comprehensive, and thank you very much for the full overview. Before we move on to Jeremy, I just have one question. You're in DC this week, meeting with NGOs, and if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you if you've been able to have any contact with our own leadership here, or anyone in the U.S. government.
So over the last few months, we have been very present and engaging at the Civil Military Coordination Center that the US has set up in Kiryat Gat. I myself have been traveling back and forth from Jerusalem pretty much every day, working both the US military, the Department of State, and the Disaster Assistance Response Team within the State Department. They have been very supportive in trying to work on a solution. I think the US has played quite a useful role in acting as a sort of go-between where there may be differences of opinion or perspective between us and the Israeli ministries to try and find a mutually agreeable solution. Because right now, especially with the interests of the US being ensuring security and the continuity of the peace plan, it's not quite the logical step to remove the actors that have the supplies ready, the staff, the expertise, and try and build something new when it's not necessary. And it's an extremely challenging environment. So now I think that we need to see if there will be an interest in the government of Israel to coming back to the table to have this discussion, so we can find a sort of way forward on this, because the stakes at this point are so high for everyone. It is really not worth the risks that are on the table to be creating a situation where life-saving assistances will actually come to a halt within the next 6 weeks. So we continue to engage, and the US has played that strong role of sort of connecting, and we hope that that's something that will result in a resolution to this soon.
Thank you, Athena. Jeremy, to you. I'm wondering now, following what Athena has given us on this, if you would like to talk about your own work in this area, your recommendations regarding the role of the CMCC and how it might be a positive factor in trying to move this issue forward, and then look a little ahead at the the anticipated Board of Peace and what that new stage could mean, particularly with respect to this issue and concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, especially.
Sure. Thank you, Catherine. And thanks to Janti and Athena for those really, really important perspectives. I agree with everything they've said. I had been hopeful, and I wrote a piece to this effect last fall, that the CMCC could represent a moment to reset humanitarian access and humanitarian operations in Gaza in line with the stated objectives and aspirations of President Trump's 20-point plan. And I think you have to say now, about 3 months into that simply hasn't happened. And that really the humanitarian commitments under the 20-point plan have badly failed. The Trump administration's overall record on humanitarian aid in Gaza has been very, very mixed. I think if you look over the last several years of the war, probably both the high point and the low point in terms of humanitarian access have both occurred in the past year under the Trump administration. They came into a ceasefire in Gaza that they had played a key role in brokering during the transition period with the Biden administration, and that saw some of the best levels of aid access and security for aid operations of any point in the war. And that was then immediately followed by the low point, which was the total Israeli blockade in the spring of last year, which laid the groundwork for the deterioration of conditions into an officially declared famine by the end of the summer. And I think what that shows is ironically, there is greater willingness by the Trump administration to put pressure on the Israelis, but then they are not using that in a strategic way to actually improve conditions on the ground in Gaza. There is a kind of a much greater laissez-faire posture towards Israeli aid obstruction by the Trump administration. And I think that is what we're seeing again now. The CMCC has not really changed that dynamic in a meaningful way. There is more getting in than was the case during the total blockade, but much of what's going in is commercial or state-based assistance from Egypt and the Emiratis. There's not a lot of visibility on what's on those trucks. We've heard some reports as well that even things that are going in as so-called Egyptian aid are actually commercial, just branded as humanitarian. So a lot of what's going in is not aid. Truck volume is not aid volume. And as Janti rightly pointed out, people have no money. So anything that is going in through the commercial sector does not necessarily help the people who most need it inside Gaza because they can't afford it. They can't afford to buy it. And as we know, anyone who has studied famines and food insecurity knows presence of food is not the issue. The population's ability to access food is the issue. And that remains very, very low for much of the population, and commercial trucking does not help that. Only aid helps that. Aid is still really being strangled to a large extent. More food is getting in, but virtually no winterization assistance is getting in. The Jordan axis, which is where much of the winterization aid sits, remains frozen. The Rafah closing, which was supposed to be opened as part of the ceasefire deal, remains closed. And of course, as Janti and Athena have talked about, there's this just completely absurd deregistration process going on now, which I think has to be seen and can only really be understood as an attempt by the Israeli government to suppress independent commentary about what's going on in Gaza. It is not about security. It is about silencing NGO advocacy. So you put all of that together, and that is how we have a situation where 3 months after the stand-up of the CMCC and this peace deal, you can still have children preventably dying of hypothermia inside Gaza. It's completely needless. It's completely absurd. It's completely avoidable. But it comes from a continued laissez-faire approach by the Trump administration towards Israeli aid obstruction. And so I think as we then look ahead to the role of the Board of Peace, the humanitarian mission, the humanitarian mandate of the Board of Peace and the Technocratic Committee really has to be judged on whether it can change the dynamic around aid obstruction. The CMCC has not managed to do so, sadly. There was some hope that it would, but it hasn't. And so that is a key test for the Board of Peace. Can it actually improve conditions inside Gaza? Can it get to a point where aid is flowing and aid organizations can operate, where they're no longer being obstructed, and where some of these key indicators around winterization, around health access, around malnutrition, actually make a definitive turn for the better? Because it is crazy that in this environment, with the war or the fighting in a nominally, I won't say over, because of course there is still a lot of violence and a lot of Palestinians are still being killed by Israeli military activity, but much diminished from what it was at the peak of the conflict. People are still dying, and they're dying for want of aid. There's no reason for that. And it really is just, I think, an extension of this period policy from the Israeli government we've seen throughout the war of trying to use aid obstruction as a means of putting political pressure on the Palestinian population in Gaza. That has to end. And if the Board of Peace can't address that, I think it will not have succeeded.
Thank you. I think that we're all sort of in the same place. We're at a critical moment. We're looking forward to we're in the midst of the winter months, and it's unclear how people on the ground are going to be able to get through this unless we see changes. And maybe I turn first to you, Athena. I mean, you're in dialogue and discussion with the Israeli government. Is there a recognition of the crisis? I mean, it's not in the interest of the Netanyahu government to see more pictures of dying children every day and to get back to where we were earlier in the summer when the issue became famine. And the pictures were on the front page of the New York Times. So even from purely self-interested approach, watching now what's going on with the flooding and the children. The other day, I think it was a 6-year-old boy drowned in the flooding because of the lack of sufficient housing. What are you hearing from your NGO partners, people from working in this area from other countries, and from your contacts? If the key people or some key people in the Israeli government understand what's coming and the danger of, just from a purely self-interested perspective, of preventing a major crisis.
Yeah, thanks so much, Catherine. And it's a good question. I think, as with any government, the folk that we work with and the leadership might not necessarily reflect the same position. So I can say confidently that there are many of my counterparts that I have been meeting with over the last year within the Israeli government that understand that there is an incredibly catastrophic situation inside Gaza, and have been working not just to enable us to bring aid in, but doing also a lot of work to try and keep our staff and the operations that we're delivering safe. That does not mean that there have not been instances of excessive, arbitrary restrictions and instances where, as you outlined in your introduction, our staff have not been safe. They have been injured, they have been killed. It is the most dangerous context for aid workers worldwide. The challenge that I'm seeing now in the discussions is that we have this battle of narratives I mentioned earlier. I have sat in meetings with our counterparts within the Israeli government ministries and said everything that I've said today to them in dialogue. I have said 1 in 3 health facilities will close inside Gaza without our services. I have said there will be no capacity inside Gaza to treat children with severe and acute malnutrition without our services. I have said, if you're interested in reconstruction, peace, stability, we need to be able to remove mines. And in many of those instances, the response I have gotten is, we don't believe you. We think that there is another agenda that you have for saying this, and we are willing to think, sort of roll the dice and say that it's fine. And for me, one of the interesting things, especially when I speak with colleagues at Israeli development organizations and rights organizations, is that the frustration from them that this does not represent their values and what will protect them, their families, their friends, because it is in no interest for us to see any return to any kind of conflict. So it is incredibly frustrating to see that we are engaging or seeing a government that is willing to take these risks. And it's not just risk to Palestinian lives, but to Israeli civilians as well. And that is the thing that is incredibly difficult to overcome. As humanitarian actors, our only goal is to be able to deliver assistance and save lives. And there have been some very difficult discussions with the Israeli authorities about the communications and advocacy work that organizations do, and why do you do that, and why should we engage with organizations that are so critical. And again, we have said, we'll happily have this discussion with you, explain why we do advocacy, why it is central to our mandate as humanitarian actors, and how we can and really have a discussion on that. There has been no point where that openness has not been expressed. So it is really troubling to see that despite all of this work, despite all of these efforts, we are moving towards a situation where my fear is that we will have to let the worst case scenario unfold. These organizations may be prevented from delivering, people will lose their lives, and there will be no way to come back from that, because once you have scaled down your infrastructure, reduced your presence, it is a very difficult thing to be able to come back and deliver, especially if the next step is that we will see this focus on bringing in GHF type style organizations or private sector companies and giving them a shot. For me personally, as an aid worker and in this position, what I have seen in Gaza, the last time I was in Gaza a few months ago, I have never seen devastation like that. And it is fundamentally impossible for me to understand why we would choose this moment in time to take such a significant and huge risk that could have such potential catastrophic consequences.
Thank you for that. And you've opened the door. We go to Jeremy to follow up on the issue of privatization more broadly, if you would, and the experience that we had with GHF, which is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and for those listening, and just the efforts of the Israeli government to move away from NGOs and into a more focus on private partners.
Yeah, there's been a very, very consistent posture by the Israeli government throughout their assault on Gaza of wanting to circumvent the normal humanitarian system and put in place and install an alternative that is more malleable, that is more compliant, that is more explicitly aligned with Israeli security goals in Gaza. And so they have suppressed the I think you have to see the registration issue that's currently playing out in that context, because that is where it comes from. It also has to be said, every single attempt they have made to do this has failed badly and backfired on them. The pier, the famous Biden aid pier, was a total debacle. The airdrops were a total debacle. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, in addition to being a total debacle as aid delivery, killed thousands of Palestinians, got thousands of Palestinians killed, largely killed by IDF on their way to GHF sites and from GHF sites, in ways that were totally predictable and were predicted by anyone who knew anything about aid distribution. I and many others pointed out that this model of funneling aid seekers through these chaotic channels to gather sites, under armed guard by the IDF, was a recipe for disaster, and daily people were getting killed. I talked to one organization that provided health clinic services inside Gaza who said that when the GHF was operating, in effect, they knew every day that there was a GHF distribution, their clinics would have to gear up for a mass casualty event, because every day they would get a massive casualties from the GHF distributions. So this is the pedigree. This is what has been going on here now for several years. And I don't think that the Israelis have given up on that. It has changed shape. But I don't think the fundamental objective has changed. And the deregistration process is just the latest chapter in that larger arc of the Israeli government trying to delegitimize and move out the UN and the NGOs that they see as, they rightly see as independent and not compliant with Israeli security goals inside Gaza, and security tactics inside Gaza. I don't, it is hard to be optimistic about where the politics land on that. I think the Trump administration has been very deferential to that view from the Israeli government.
We paid for it. We funded it.
They bankrolled part of the GHF, although I think there is some buyer's remorse on that. I hope there's some buyer's remorse on that. I think there is. So going forward, that has to continue to be on everyone's radar screen. And I don't expect great things out of the US on this. I would like to see the Gulf and the Europeans step up on this more. There was a moment over the summer during the aid blockade when the Europeans started saber rattling on trade sanctions in response to the aid obstruction. They then got very quiet on that again after the ceasefire deal. I think the Europeans should keep the pressure up there because it does matter, and they are the largest trading partner for Israel. So there is leverage outside the US if other states choose to use it.
Thank you. I mean, we have some good questions in the chat, but before we go there, I just wanted to give you, Janti, a moment if you'd like to comment on, I mean, SAVE has worked closely on issues like family reunification, orphans, I believe. And also, we are now entering we're in the third year of no education for children in Gaza. Now, I know when you're starving and when you're dying from exposure to the elements, education isn't a top issue, but you've said and talked about the role of education in psychosocial support and in preventing other issues. Would you like to comment on that before we move on?
Sure, and I'll also support some of my colleagues' comments. Look, Save the Children will always say, and here's no exception, that education is actually life-saving. It was interesting. I was in Gaza in March of 24, and I was talking to a group of children and their mothers, and they were talking about all the issues that they had. There were 600 people. They literally had one toilet. I mean, it was already pretty dire then, and it's now worse. And at one point, this mom said to me, in terms of what do they need? She said, of course, we have no food. My kids have no shoes, et cetera, et cetera. But what I need most is mental health support because we've been displaced. I've seen the kids of my neighbors die in a tent who was set on fire, et cetera, et cetera. So just to show that when you ask children caught up in crises like this one, but elsewhere around the world, what they say is we want to go back to school. Why? Not because they necessarily want to learn their A to Z's, but because they want to be with their friends. They want to be children, and they want that normalcy and structure of an education environment. So that is what we do try to provide, even in a situation like Gaza. And that's why we're running these learning spaces. And that's why a lot of and so do other not-for-profits as well. So I do think it is really part of essentially mental health and psychosocial support, as well as helping children reclaim just a little bit of their childhood that is completely disrupted. Just to support some of the things that Athena said, let's be very clear that Save the Children and AIDA and all its members have tried to go out of their way to find compromises here. It's not that we're sitting here going like we're going on strike, we don't want to give data, all the rest of it. We have offered compromises. We are not against vetting. We vet staff everywhere, not just in Gaza, across. It's required, but it's also what we want to do because we want to make sure that we have staff that deliver the best quality support for vulnerable people. So we do the vetting. We have offered. We said we are very open to having third-party mechanisms to exercise that. We were comfortable with that. We want to help make that happen. But again, it's been really difficult to actually even get a meeting to discuss these things. And even when there was a meeting, sometimes there hasn't really been take up of those offers. So it's not that we don't understand the concerns of all the parties involved here. We really try to do, all we want to do is to do our work, and to do our work at scale in order to save lives. That is what we want. And yes, part of the roles that we have there, because we've been there and we are on the ground and we speak to people all the time and we have staff there, of course we're bearing witness to what we see, but the world needs to know.
Yeah.
The world needs to know what's going on and what we collectively are allowing to happen.
Yeah, and thank you for the work that you do. I'm going to turn to one of the questions here in the chat that goes really to the issue of how the situation can go on in light of the potential inability of certain actors to work for a period of time. Reports so far have stated that the Israeli government is delisting 37 NGOs. What does the operation capacity look like for any NGOs that have secured registration? Athena, can you shoot at that one?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So there are around, I believe, 24 organizations, give or take a couple, that have been registered inside Israel. When you look at the makeup of these organizations, so I'll cover them in sort of sections. The largest section of those organizations that have been registered are primarily new organizations with little to no history operating inside Gaza or the West Bank. Some of them have only been registered as 501c3s in the US, for example, since June. They don't have staff, they don't have supplies, they don't have expertise, and they're also not what we would describe as humanitarian organizations, which means as a humanitarian organization, there are a set of principles that you abide by. These are principles that are important because they're not just principles, they protect your operations, they're practical, they ensure you keep access, they protect your staff. So that is the vast majority of those organizations. They are not large. They are primarily, not the ones doing the large food distributions, running education services, doing mine clearance. A couple of them do. There have been a couple of organizations that have been registered that are larger organizations. Our understanding is that there has been some weighing in by the US administration on behalf of some organizations. We also understand that there has been an inconsistency applied with which organizations are held to certain standards with regards to their communications and advocacy and with regards to the documentation requirements. So there have been some organizations that have been registered that have done a lot of advocacy that other organizations have been told they are delegitimizing the state of Israel for. And at the same time, some organizations have also been registered without the submission of Palestinian staff lists for vetting. So in terms of the footprint, these organizations don't represent the sort of largest part of delivery in Gaza by any means whatsoever. Some of them have fantastic, very credible, legitimate organizations, but it's not enough to say, we had around 50, 60 operational NGOs working with our Palestinian NGO partners and UN agencies. There is a reason that the infrastructure runs like that. It is not in anyone's interest either to have so few organizations trying to scale up to that level of delivery, especially if the professed issue is aid diversion, because the larger one organization gets, the more programming you have versus those staff working on risk and compliance and your leadership. So it's really in no one's interest to be reducing organizations' oversight by asking them to scale up to a level that we don't deliver at that scale as one organization, really anywhere. That's why we work together. We coordinate so we don't overlap. We do referrals, we share services. I think similar to what Jeremy was saying earlier, the humanitarian system is not perfect by any means, but we have arrived at this system through immense amount of trial and error. It is as bare bones as it can get. It is efficient. It protects people's dignity. Yes, there are things that need to be worked out, but there is a reason the system functions as it does, and that it is not just one UN agency, 5 NGOs, and no national actors. This is the way that we work in order to not just be able to efficiently deliver services, but also do the important work that I mentioned earlier, probably some of the most important, which is to ensure a sustainable exit strategy where we are actually reducing dependence and bringing people out of life-saving assistance to actually moving forward and building their lives as something more than just surviving day by day.
Jeremy, I see you nodding your head. Would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I think it bears emphasis that these actions by the Israeli government towards the NGOs genuinely are not about diversion concerns, and they are genuinely not. They do not reduce or mitigate diversion in any way. That was the rationale stated for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation as well, that that their aid model through these secure distribution sites, so-called, would be less amenable to diversion. And again, to any professional humanitarian who knows how you set up an aid distribution, that was farcical. And what we saw was chaos. Anyone could have been picking up those packages. The reports on GHF distribution how this actually played out in practice were that the packages disproportionately were seized in bulk by the youngest, strongest, fastest men. Who knows who those men were? There was no identity verification. It certainly was not getting to the most vulnerable. Much of what they were grabbing, they would then open up the packets. They'd get away from the site, open up the packets, strip out the most valuable items, leave the rest, and go resell those in the market. Who were those men? Who knows? Who was reselling those things in the market? Who knows? If you were sincerely concerned about aid diversion, that is the last way you would distribute aid.
Exactly.
Likewise, what we're seeing now, while NGO shipments into Gaza still remain almost completely blocked, there is this huge flow of commercial goods going in. Again, who knows what's in it? We do know that some of the things that the Israeli government blocks NGOs from bringing in because they're considered dual use items, so-called, when NGOs bring them in, are coming in on those commercial shipments. And then the NGOs have to pay extraordinary rates for them inside Gaza once they arrive. So again, it is utterly insincere. And it is really just a ploy and a tactic by the Israeli government to suppress independent humanitarian voice inside Gaza, and has nothing to do with genuine or sincere concerns about security or diversion.
And not very efficient either. If your main objective is, and we get sometimes criticized for that, and in some cases, fair enough, we're not perfect. But if you're really looking for efficiency, Gaza is actually a context where you could deliver assistance really efficiently. It's not landlocked. It's you can get in. You can get your arms around it. It's densely populated. You can actually distribute safely with compliance, and the data is there. The population is highly educated. It's you could really do it really well, much easier than in a lot of other places where Save the Children is trying to reach people, and you can't get through. It's physically remote, etc., etc. Here, we're pretending that airdrops and piers, newly built piers, over $320 million, or other newly found mechanisms or new organizations, that is an efficient way of delivering assistance. It is hugely wasteful, aside from the dramatic impact on human lives.
True. Can I ask you, Janti, there is a question in the chat. If you don't feel comfortable answering it, you don't have to. But essentially, the question is about the timeline for organizations that have received a notice, and what time they have to respond, what time they have to contest or repeal, and all of those things.
So it's a little unclear, and all the various organizations are, I think, in slightly different processes and timelines, right? We have appealed. We're still waiting. We are open to a constructive conversation to understand better what actually the criticism or the concerns are around how we deliver aid, what we say or don't say, or how do we vet our staff? As I said, we're open to all these solutions and ideas. So it's a little unclear. I mean, our international staff has had to leave because their visa were not renewed. Now, we can absolutely operate remotely, and we do so. We do that in a lot of other places as well, and we have done so over the years. But clearly it is not ideal because our staff in Gaza also needs continued support. They've been at this for over 2 years and of course are heavily impacted themselves. A lot of them live in tents and struggle to put food on the table for their own children, etc. So it is unclear, frankly. I mean, Athena might know better and more detailed. For now, we're doing what we can. We're delivering assistance when we can, to the best of our abilities, and we will continue to do so, until we can't.
I just want to piggyback on that comment. It is amazing that, and people don't think about it who aren't involved in it, that it's the local people who are experiencing the deprivation and the bombing and the circumstances that have been the core group that is doing the delivery for most NGOs, even prior to these restrictions. And their strength, their ability to carry on as they face all these things is really amazing. And a group of amazing people, as you all are. And sort of brings us to the conclusion. Athena, if you would like to make the final comment on that, we can do that before we conclude, or you're set.
Sure, I maybe just to add one last thing, and I think it is an important thing to note, is that there are a number of states that have recognized the state of Palestine. There is a role underscored within Trump's 20-point plan for the Palestinian Authority. INGO organizations that operate inside Gaza and the West Bank are registered with the Palestinian Authority. So I also think it's a really important point to note that it would really represent a new precedent if we are agreeing that Israel's control and dominion over Gaza and the West Bank means they can decide what happens inside, because that has not been the status quo. If they choose not to facilitate our assistance, that's certainly in contravention with their obligations and will have consequences. But if we are agreeing as an international community that this is the new status quo, this has implications far beyond just the delivery of assistance, but also on the peace plan and the future for Palestinians and Israelis. And this is a really important point, I think, when we are fundamentally, as I think we've all said, the goal here is to keep everyone safe, to allow everyone to live in dignity, and to move beyond this cycle of violence and conflict that we have seen replicated and repeated for decades.
That's a very important point, and really a good point to end this conversation on. I want to thank all of you for everything you do on this issue and others, and thank you on behalf of Carnegie for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.